Hello everyone, I hope you're excited about towns and farming because that's what our topic is today. Starting around the year 1000, better times for Europe began. And the main thing there is the end of the major invasions. So the Vikings have converted and settled down, the Magyars have converted and settled down. There are fewer outside influences coming in from invading forces. So just simply not having any invading forces to fight must have had some successful effects on the European population. We're going to talk about some technological innovations today. I'm going to talk about three. There are actually more of them that we could potentially talk about. But these are technological changes, something called the horse collar. And it's very strange to think that just a very simple change in the way horses are harnessed could change agriculture, but it does. The three-field crop rotation system, and something called a carruca, which is a wheeled plow. Now, more food stemming from these technological innovations means more population. And when we're in class, we're going to talk about how that works. It's estimated that there were 36 million people in Europe, including the Baltic, Poland, and Eastern Europe, in the year 1000, and 79 million in 1300. So a very significant change in population. And more population tends to mean a whole bunch of things for a given society. So here's a little bit more of a look at that population change. Right, so here we are in the year 1000, there's 36 million. Right, and look at the way the population exponentially jumps over the next 200 years. I'm going to start by talking about the three-field system. And I think we'll talk more about this in class just to try to understand the way it works. But basically, a farm in the Middle Ages was a set of land that was divided up into strips. And those strips were planted in a fall crop and a fallow crop. So what fallow means is that you don't plant anything on the land, you just leave it to sit, maybe graze your cows on it so that it has a chance to recover from having to grow grain the year before. So that's a two-field system. In the High Middle Ages, a three-field system came into effect in which there was a fall crop, a spring crop, and fallow, so you have three things going at once. Along with that, there's an increased use of legumes like beans, which provide a definitive improvement to the medieval diet. As you probably know, beans are high in iron, they're also high in fiber, and they're also high in protein. So you can't do better, especially if you're living on a mostly plant-based diet. It's hard to do better than beans. The other thing that beans do is that they're what's called a nitrogen fixative. They make the land that they are planted on more fertile for things like wheat or oats or barley. The production getting so much better means that fewer people are needed to keep the population fed. And I can't really emphasize this enough. If you don't have sufficient food coming into your population, there's no place in your population for things like art, writing, theater, and all of those wonderful things that we think of as being artistic. Okay, horse collar. Right. Two different types of harnessing here. On the left, you can see a basic Roman-style harness. It has a strap over the horse's back and a strap around the horse's shoulders. This right here is the horse's windpipe. So if a horse in this type of harness pulls too hard, it's actually cutting off its own air, which is not the best way to do it. Sometime in the Middle Ages, the horse collar was invented, and you can kind of see here from the top what that looks like. And you've probably seen one as hung as decoration somewhere if you didn't grow up seeing them yourself. And it's a padded ring of leather that sits on the horse's shoulders. So when the horse pulls, the weight of the pulling actually lands on his shoulders and not on his windpipe, which means that a horse with a horse collar can pull far heavier loads and pull longer than a horse with a Roman-style harness. This is also the period where the horseshoe is invented, and our artist has even done that for us here. No shoes on this horse, but shoes on this one. Okay. This is a medieval illustration of a carruca, a wheeled plow pulled by oxen. This is a tiny portrait in a very large piece of art, so we'll give the artist a miss on the fact that he seems to have forgotten to draw any harness on the oxen. But basically, a carruca is a wheeled plow which digs into the soil and flips it over and aerates the soil better than if you were using an old-time scratch plow. We can talk about that in class more if you like. Here's another illustration of a carruca, this time with a set of 4 oxen. And these plows are often very, very heavy, so it takes a team of oxen to pull them as opposed to a single beast. Okay, from farming to trade. No surprises, when there is less violence going on around in Europe, it's a lot easier to move things around, and trade picks up. In the Mediterranean, Italy is the center of the economic system. Down there in Venice, they're trading with Constantinople. Genoa and Pisa are trading with France, and in just a moment I'll show you some of the trade routes that developed during this period. Now, it's not that these roads weren't there before. In fact, they cover some of the roads that were originally Roman roads. But the fact that trade is moving back and forth between these peoples makes a huge difference to the economy. We haven't talked about the Crusades yet, but we will very soon. The Crusades created a demand for luxury goods, silk, which Europeans did not know of in the early Middle Ages. It's different kinds of spices. Black pepper is the sort of crown jewel of the spices. Sugar, which they have only had access to through fruit sugars and honey and things like that, but actual sugar from the Middle East, and various perfumes that come from the Middle East as well. I want to add that one of the things that is being traded in this period is slaves. We're going to talk more about slavery in a couple of classes, but suffice to say that there is never a period in the period that we're talking about this semester in which there is not slavery. Slavery is normal and expected in the ancient and medieval worlds. England and France are exporting their own important crops. The wool crop from England, English wool, is the best on the market. And of course, the French produce the best wine anywhere. Okay, here are the trade routes that I was referring to. And if you get a chance to sort of stop the slide here and look at some of the stuff that's moving, right? Amber from up here in Poland is still a big thing to get amber jewelry in Poland. Linen and woolen from northern France. This is where all the wool and the linen is getting woven into cloth. The cloth comes down into Italy to be sold, sometimes to be shipped out a long way. You can see that there are a bunch of things that come out of Spain, particularly alum, which is mined at this time, and there are silver mines in the region of Toledo. Lumber and furs from Eastern Europe, lots and lots of different luxury goods coming from Constantinople, overland, and by sea. The black line represents the travel of Marco Polo in the 13th century. Marco Polo went to China in 1285, spent a number of years there, and finally returned as a grown man and wrote a book about his experiences, which we now know is made more of fiction than fact, but which is very entertaining reading. But Polo definitely got all the way to China, and what he saw there still bears some historical interest, even though it's pretty clear that he had an active imagination as well. There's lots more trade. It's safer to move around, and so towns begin to grow. There is a migration from countryside to the towns. Free peasants from the countryside moving into towns where they can practice perhaps things like cheese making or beer brewing. Artisans, people who are making and selling things like tinware and gold and things like that. Runaway serfs, I'll explain that in just a second. And a growing middle class of merchants. Now remember that the old tripartite system was the prayers, the fighters, and the workers. Now we have the sellers as well. Now to make that make sense, I need to talk about town charters. By the middle of the 11th century, towns were beginning to band together and ask for concessions from their feudal overlords to give them the right to do certain things inside their boundaries. And those are called town charters. Usually it asks or requires that anything that is bought or sold inside the town is exempt from taxation, for example, or that a certain percentage of the sales in a given town are owed to the lord. One of the big ones is the idea that runaway serfs who stay free for a year and a day are no longer serfs. So if you are a serf and you leave the farm where you are enserfed, I think that's a word, enserfed, enslaved would probably be more accurate. If you can get to a town that has one of these charters and stay there for a year and a day, you are no longer a serf. That's what that German phrase there, Stadtluft macht frei, means town air makes you free. Town air makes freedom. Now, as the time went on, the town charters become more and more complicated, and eventually the term commune comes to be used for them. This is particularly true in France, where towns become independent from their local lords and govern the countryside around on their own behalf. So these are places that are being ruled not by lords but by the middle class, and that is a big change for Europe. The last thing I want to talk about is something called the guild system. People who do a particular job, whether that's weaving or goldsmithing or tinsmithing or leather curing, you can think of lots of them, I'm sure, would get together and make themselves into guilds. And a guild is a sort of like a fraternal organization, not too different from, say, the Elks or the Masons at this time, in order to preserve the regulation of trades and manufacturing. So if you live in a town and you are a smith of some kind, for example, you're going to be a member of the guild. A guild functions also a little bit like a trade union. So there's a training system, there's a social and religious function, and there's an economic function. All three of these things combine to make the quality of goods as high as possible and limiting the market to make sure that the prices stay high or stay under control, as the case might be. We'll talk about the training system and the social and religious functions in class.